Distilled spirits. We are looking at alcoholic beverages that are distilled in order to increase the concentration of alcohol within the beverage. When we look at distilled spirits, we're going to talk about carbohydrate source. The source of the carbohydrates makes a difference in the beverage that is produced. When you look at these beverages, there are different ones in there that have different materials. Therefore, the carbohydrate source makes a big difference. Mashing. Mashing doesn't change from beer. Basically, in mashing, you are getting the carbohydrate ready so that it can be fermented properly. Then we add the yeast. The yeast is allowed to ferment for a time period. It's going to increase the concentration as much as possible. It will only go up to a concentration of somewhere around 17 to 20% before the ethanol actually becomes toxic to the yeast. Then we have the process of distilling. And distilling is where the material is heated up to drive off the ethanol. The ethanol is then collected, and then we can continue on with the making of the beverage. Sometimes at this point they add flavors. There's two ways of adding flavors. You can add the flavor to the distilled product as it sits and ages, like in a barrel. You can add flavors where they allow the material to steep overnight and then they distill it again. Sometimes we do distill it again. When you distill it again, it tries to purify it even more. Depending on the type of beverage, it is distilled a second time or a third time. Sometimes we have the aging process. The aging process is where you take a material, you put it into something like a barrel, and you let it sit. Some that are aged for 3 years, some that are aged for 30 years. When we do this, it becomes a very unique process. Distillation. Ethanol has a boiling point of 78.37 degrees Celsius. Water boils at 100. We have to raise the temperature up to around 79 in order to drive off the ethanol. As you do that, some of the water will be driven off as well. You will get an alcoholic content of the material coming out. We have a pot still, which is like a big recipient. You'd have a single heat source on the bottom of it. You can increase the concentration up to about 40 to 50% ethanol. They also have a column still. A column still is a graduated column. It will have different heat zones on the inside. A column still can increase the concentration up to 95+% ethanol. When you look at these stills, a lot of these older stills are made out of copper. Copper is used because the copper reacts with the sulfur in the material, removes the sulfates. The sulfur would give it a bitter taste or would give it a strange flavor. Getting the sulfur out becomes very important. That's why we look at copper stills. This shows you a pot still. This is from a brewery. They put the material into it, then they heat it up. They've got a single heat source. It's going to drive the material off. You then collect the condensate from it. You can use the condensate. Some of them get to be quite large. Flavoring. Bunch of different ways of doing flavoring. One is to steep it with aromatic materials. That would be something like this. This was from a gin factory in Brazil. And they had different seeds and orange peel and things like nutmeg. They would put the material into their ethanol mixture. They would let it sit overnight. After it sat overnight, they filtered it and they distilled it. When you distilled it, some of the aromatic materials get distilled along with it. There's oils in the orange peel. Some of the flavorings from those orange peel oils get stuck into the distillation process so that it goes through. And then they would take the material out, and then they'd flavor it with something else, and then they'd distill it a third time. We've got different ways of steeping it in material like that. Aging. The material could be aged in barrels. This happens to be out of a wine cellar. When you look at some of the videos, you will see that the way they age whiskey is the same way. They take the barrel, they burn the inside of the barrel, or they char it a little bit. They put the material in for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. During that time, some of the flavors that are in the wood come out into the whiskey. It gives it a very subtle flavor or a very unique flavor. Then they will taste it. They will check it. You can see some of the barrels look like some of the material's leaking out. Yes, material does leak out at times. You have to be very careful about this. If it can leak out, that can let air in. Air would ruin the process. We don't want these things oxidizing. Aging it in wood is very important. Next part is bottling. After they've got it all together, they put it into bottles. This is an automatic bottling machine. It would bring in the bottles on the one side. the bottle would be picked up, pushed against the top. It starts injecting the proper amount of fluid to fill this up. And then this would be sealed and they'd be labeled and put into the containers. These are decorative containers. These are actually ceramic type containers. This was at a gin bottling factory. They made a absolutely marvelous gin, and then they would sell the containers like that. There are a lot of different carbohydrates that we can use to produce ethanol. Carbohydrate source. We got whiskey. Whiskey comes from corn, from wheat, from rye. So there are a lot of different types of material in there. This shows you Crown Royal, which is considered to be one of the better ones. This is Dewar's. You can see that this is a blended Scotch whiskey. Brownish coloration to it actually comes from the soaking in the wood barrels. This is old Jack Daniel. Jack Daniel's is 86 proof, which is 43% alcohol. We have potatoes, which are used to produce vodka. Vodka is very clear. It does not need to be aged. Vodka actually has very little smell to it. The true vodka is made with potatoes. We have rum, or cachaça as they call it down in Brazil. This is made out of sugarcane. Rum, we're looking at a clear liquid. This is Havana Club from Cuba. This is overproof rum out of Jamaica. This is a cachaça out of Brazil. This particular one has a little bit of color to it, but a lot of times these things are clear and are made out of sugarcane. We have cognac, which is made from wine. They take the wine and they distill the wine, they get the cognac out of it. It's got a much higher alcohol content to it. It is a much modified flavor from what you would get out of wine. We have gin. Gin comes from various sources of carbohydrate. Then they flavor it with different materials. Distilled 4 times, it's made from the world's finest botanicals, which means they're taking things like juniper berries and other material that are going to impart a flavor to it. They steep them in their orange peel. They allow them to soak, then they distill that, then they come back, they steep it in other materials, and they distill that. Finally, in the end, they get a gin that is bottled almost directly. You can see that gin is a little bit different. And we got tequila. Tequila comes from agave. The blue agave is native to Mexico. This is Jose Cuervo Special Tequila Gold made with blue agave. It is fermented. You get the flavoring from it. All of these have higher levels of alcohol. They are all distilled at some point, and the distillation process allows you to increase the concentration of the alcohol. Then if people want, they can mix that with something else. They can come back to a smaller drink. A dose of this is normally considered to be about 1.5 ounces. That goes in a little shot glass. They take the shot glass, put the material in it, and drink it down.